Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Kidnapped. My troubles began from the moment that I raised my hand and knocked at the iron-studded door of the House of Shaws. There I stood, David Balfour, in the warmth of a June evening. I was 17. I had a few shillings in my pocket, and my parents were dead. I also had a letter of introduction to my uncle, Ebenezer Balfour of Shaws. He was my only relative, and a rich man. A sound made me look up, into the muzzle of a blunderbuss. From the open window, a voice called,
"Who's there?"
My uncle had welcomed me to the House of Shaws. Grudgingly, Uncle Ebenezer gave me a meal and a bed for the night. The house was a grim barracks of a building, partly unfurnished. Even those parts that were complete were damp and crumbling. I had thought that the Laird of Shaws would live in style. My uncle lived alone, a miser, hated by all the people in the countryside around. On the night after my arrival, the weather grew stormy. As we sat by a feeble fire in the kitchen, Uncle Ebenezer handed me a key.
"Fetch me down the chest from the room at the top of the tower,"
he said. The tower entrance was outside the house, and I groped my way in the glare of the lightning. Halfway to the top, a brighter flash than before filled the tower with light, and I saw that I stood on the edge of the last complete step. Below me was a dark, yawning gap. A moment later, and I should have fallen to my death. Afraid and angry, I returned to the kitchen. Uncle Ebenezer looked up, startled as I entered. Then he fell to the floor in a faint. Had he planned to murder me? Next morning, my uncle treated my near disaster as a joke. He had business in the nearby town of Queensferry, he said, and invited me to accompany him. The business was with his lawyer, Ron Keeler, and a Captain Hoseason of the brig Covenant. We met the captain at an inn, and I got into conversation with the ship's boy. He told me that the Covenant regularly carried convicted criminals and other unwilling passengers to become slaves in the American colonies. When the captain invited us to visit his ship where it lay at anchor, I was eager to go. My uncle and I were rowed out to the vessel. I was first aboard. I turned in time to see the boat and Uncle Ebenezer heading back towards the shore. Then, a heavy blow to the head sent me tumbling senseless on the deck. I awoke to find myself a prisoner below decks, where I remained for many days while the ship sailed north, then west between the islands of Orkney and Shetland. And then I was allowed on deck to find that the wind had turned foul and was pushing us steadily south. To make matters worse, the weather grew foggy. Even as the sailors peered into the murk, there was a cry, then a crash. The Covenant had collided with another vessel. It was a fishing boat, and quickly lost to view. But not before one man had leapt upwards to seize hold of the Covenant's bowsprit and pulled himself to safety. That is how I came to meet Alan Breck Stewart. He was a short man, and something of a dandy in his plumed hat, blue coat with silver buttons, and a sword by his side. I had been put to work in the roundhouse, a cabin in the middle part of the ship, which doubled as officers' quarters and ship's armory. Alan was quartered in the roundhouse, and I quickly got to know him. We had something in common, neither of us being willing passengers on board. As we became friends, I learned that he was a Jacobite. When Prince Charlie failed to win the throne in 1746, his followers fled, many abroad. Such was Alan Breck Stewart. But during the last 5 years, he had returned to Scotland many times in secret to collect money for Ardshiel, his exiled clan chief. He was completing such a mission when his boat was run down by the Covenant. The money, a fortune in gold coin, he carried in a belt around his waist. But the captain and crew found out about the belt of gold and were determined to have it. We barricaded ourselves in the roundhouse. I loaded all the pistols I could find, while Alan, sword drawn, stationed himself by the door. And not a moment too soon. Led by the captain, the crew stormed the roundhouse. The battle was fast and furious. Twice we repelled attack, partly by my firing pistols out of the window, but chiefly by Alan's brilliant swordsmanship.
Am I not a bonny fighter?
He cried in triumph. Then he rewarded me for my part in the victory with a silver button cut from his coat. With most of the crew dead or wounded, the captain asked for a truce. Alan made him agree to land him on the shore of Loch Lynny, close to his own clan country of Appin. But short-handed, the ship was difficult to manage. In the middle of the night, she ran onto a reef off the coast of the island of Mull. Held fast, she was helpless in the path of a giant wave. In a moment, I was swept overboard. Clinging to a spar, I was carried ashore by the current onto a small, barren island. For 4 days, I wandered the island, exhausted, cold, and hungry. I ate raw shellfish and wept with vexation at the closeness of the main island across a narrow strait. To make it worse, I could see the smoke from a chimney rising above a low hill. Then the crew of a fishing boat hailed me and pointed to the strait. And I realized that when the tide was at its lowest ebb, the channel between the islands almost dried out. Wasting not another moment, I waded across, the water little more than knee-deep. By evening, I had reached the house whose chimney smoke I had seen. It was a cottage, low, stone-built, and roofed with turf. An old man sat smoking his pipe before the door. He told me that the survivors of the wreck of the Covenant had already passed that way. Then I showed him Alan's silver button.
Ah,
He said.
I have a message for the lad with the button. You're to go by the way of Torsay to join your friend in Appin.
After a meal and a night's rest, I said goodbye to the old gentleman and his wife. 4 days' walking took me across Mull to Torsay, from where I crossed by ferry to Loch Alind on the mainland. The ferry skipper was one Neil Roy McRobb. Alan had told me that the McRobbs were kin to the Appin Stewarts, and I again produced my button. And again there was a message for me. I was to make my way to the house of John of the Claymore in Ardgour, and from there to seek out James of the Glens in Appin at a place called Achán. As I left the ferry, Neil Roy McRobb warned me to stay clear of patrols of the Red Soldiers. The inn at Loch Lynn was a miserable place. During the night it rained, and the floor became ankle-deep in water. I was more than glad to leave early in the morning. I was scarcely on my way when I overtook a stout little man. He had a very solemn expression, read a book while he walked, and had the look of a minister about him. He proved a pleasant and useful companion. He was a lowlander like myself, a travelling preacher. His name was Henderland. He told me of the troubles which had befallen the Highlands after the defeat of the Jacobites. He spoke of the Red Fox, and here I pricked up my ears. On board ship, Alan had often spoken that name, usually in anger. He had even sworn to kill the man who bore it. Who was he, I asked. The Red Fox, explained Mr. Henderland, was the nickname of Colin Campbell of Glenure. He was one of the king's agents sent to administer the lands of dead or exiled Jacobites. Everyone in Appin hated him and would dearly like to see him dead. I spent that night as a guest of Mr. Henderland. Next morning, he arranged for me to be taken across Loch Lynny in a fishing boat. As we neared the farther shore, I saw a column of the Red Soldiers marching by the lochside into Appin. the fisherman put me ashore where the wood of Lettermore came close to the water's edge. The trees clung to the steep mountainside, and a narrow, twisting track served as a road. I was sitting by a wayside spring, eating the oat bread given me by Mr. Hendland for my journey, when there came the sounds of men and horses. Leading their mounts along the track came 4 men. One was obviously a Highland servant, a portmanteau and a bag of lemons slung on his horse's back. In front of him came a man whose black clothes and white wig showed him to be a lawyer, and, bringing up the rear, one in the dress of a sheriff's officer. But it was the leader of the party who caught my special attention. He was a bluff, red-headed figure of commanding appearance who fanned himself with his hat in the noonday heat.